Hello everybody and welcome to Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack, and if you guys are looking for PTCGO codes, including the latest set Battle Styles, make sure you check out the Potown store where you can get a 5% discount on your order using code OMNIPOKE. Today I'm back with the second week's results from the Battle Styles meta. Obviously I did this video last week. Basically we only had one or two tournaments to look at. We've had another week of tournaments now, which is really exciting, and we can definitely start to see some trends in the meta, at least in the early couple of weeks. This one will be a little bit less in depth in particular archetypes of like one tournament, because obviously there's 5 tournaments I want to cover here, and I don't want this video to be super long, so instead of sort of going in depth on every single top 8 deck, I'm just going to pick out a few of the standout ones, as well as sort of trends we're starting to see. And then we'll check out some dyno data at the end as well. So yeah, the first tournament last week that we was actually the day it was recorded, so I didn't include this, was the Hegster. Hegster number 38. This was the first Hegster legal with Battle Styles. And we actually see a very interesting win from Dragapult, a Greens Dragapult list. A very, very interesting list. Turns out that kind of Dragapult is doing well in the meta. Eternatus kind of dipped a little bit, so maybe that was why Dragapult has started to surface, though you'll see Eternatus is beginning to come back as well. But yeah, really interesting list. We haven't seen a Greens deck do amazingly well for too long, other than the Coco deck that got like a top 32 placement, but we haven't seen a Greens deck taking down a tournament in a very long time, from what I can recall. Pretty standard for a Greens deck, though, to be honest. Got some disruption. Got, you know, the stamp package, got the little Omastar combo going on there, and then just some solid draw supporters. Being able to research and greens on your early turns is obviously really, really good. Fans, along with crushings, can be really, really detrimental to some of the decks that it's super important to be getting an energy on turn 1 and 2. Power plant, obviously, very big for, obviously you're not playing abilities yourself, so being able to turn off things like Dedenne is obviously always going to be very important, as well as actually accessing turning off Jirachis, which is great in this meta, because obviously Jirachi GX is seeing a lot more play, because it removes the weakness from Urshifus and Mewtwo's. So I really like the list. Greens decks inherently are very, very difficult to play. There's a lot of decisions in them, and typically it is kind of a buck to the trend when a Greens deck does very well and then continues to do well. And we haven't really seen too much from this list ever since, but I definitely think there's a place for this kind of list. The format is still fairly aggressive, and that can kind of put a bit of a dampener on green style decks, but I still think we could see something here. And with more sort of players trying this out, I could see this going somewhere. But yeah, nothing too special, just kind of your standard greens sort of bits and bobs. The 1+ Cephalon is also really nice for dealing with the 1 prizes on the bench. Being able to drop 12 counters is just crazy still. So yeah, very, very interesting list winning. Mewtwo came second. I'm not going to image all of these. I'll just probably image the interesting ones. This Mewtwo list, pretty standard to be honest. Nothing crazy. Scoop up net package with Giratina, Mewtwo instead of Eldegoss, and the Jirachi sort of engine. Other than that, pretty standard. No real points of note. Interestingly though, only Fire Energy. We do come across a couple of Mewtwo lists playing Aurora builds later down the line. So yeah, Desi came third, and this is a pretty standard Desi list. A lot of different sort of answers for this, that, and the other. Fiona is probably one of the most interesting ones, just for dealing with baby Blounds. But we haven't really seen, again, as you'll see as we get into this, the Desi list really move away from a lot of these answers. Also running the Swanna package that I now have been made aware that it's to help deal with things like Volcanium. So thank you to everyone who commented that. Really, really good to know. I'm glad I asked the question, because asking questions in that kind of in these kind of videos also helps me learn. So yeah, really glad I asked about that. So I learned something there. But yeah, still lots of different answers. You will start to see with some of the Desi lists we look at down the line, though, they start to cut the answers, which is crazy to me. ADP made top 4. This is a very, very sort of techie build. It's got lots of one-ofs and the one Skylar to hopefully fish out some of these one-ofs. Playing the one Empoleon. Empoleon and Mewtwo seem to be the two kind of new additions to the Pokemon side of ADP lately. Obviously, both of them hitting for different weaknesses is really important. Both of them hitting great numbers as well. So typically you'll see one or the other of them. Very rarely both, and sometimes neither. But yeah, very interesting stuff. Also playing an Aurora. A lot of these lists are still sticking to just the basics, but this is an Aurora. Well, there is an Aurora in here. Interestingly though, no sort of tag call package though. But yeah, other than that, like I say, just a very, very techie list. Only 2 Switch and 2 Escape Rope is something that I am very wary of, simply because I've been seeing lists playing 4 Switch, 4 Rope, and I think 4 Switch, 4 Rope is very, very important, to be honest, or very, very good, to be honest, just because it means you're able to pressure the bench without having to boss, but also just means you're able to get into the active and reset, or get to the bench and then get to the active and reset Brave Blade so much more often. So yeah, I really, really like the ropes, to be honest, and I would be an advocate of seeing more of them. This list does indeed play the 4 though, and as you can see, this list is also playing the Mewtwo. So yeah, again, this is a little bit less techy, still running the Skylar, but in general, yeah, pretty much ADP is kind of settling now, I think. We have a Frostmoth Inteleon list. Joe did a video, not on this exact list, but on an Inteleon deck this week, after it's seen some sort of standout success recently, which is really interesting. Unfortunately, I expect that to diminish a little bit, since Pikarom reared its ugly head once again this weekend. But it was nice to see Inteleon back in the limelight for a little while. Again, nothing sort of crazy about this, just kind of get your, level ball helps you get your Frostmoths out to be able to attach your Inteleons. A lot of these one-offs, again, are really, really scary to me in a deck where I feel like you want to be as consistent as possible. Cutting into the Evo Incense and the Com count and even the Quick Ball count for some of these niche one-offs is a bit scary, but obviously it worked out. Also, the one Rose is pretty cool as well. But yeah, another Mewtwo Welder making top 8 as well. Again, a Scoop Up Net build. This is the first Victini we're talking about today as well, rounding out top 8, and this was a Ninetales build, which is really interesting. Only the 2 Welder, so really leaning into sort of the early pressure of trying to just attach and research to find Ninetales and be able to basically research on turn 1 and turn 2, rather than going Welder or Boss in the early turns. This is a very, very aggressive list, trying to go research into research, but supplementing that with a Ninetales line to be able to do the gusting. So yeah, very interesting. We've started to see this list pop up a little bit more. I don't know whether it'll come out on top. We've seen some success from just very, very basic sort of 4 Welder, 4 Boss lists. But it's nice to see this Ninetales list do well, and I think we have another one to look at later on. I could be wrong though, but yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Trimming down on the Welders, typically the very, very strong cards of Fire decks, and just pushing towards the Ninetales instead. Rounding out top 16, we had a Mad Party, a Dragapult Urshifu, a couple of other Urshifu lists, another Dragapult Urshifu actually. So Urshifu, or Rapid Strike, still failing to break top 8, but is starting to get some top 16 placements. Kind of, not necessarily as I predicted in the video last week, but I kind of expected it to happen naturally. Just the more people got familiar with the deck, the more they would know the capabilities of the deck and know kind of what its limitations are and how to push it into that top 8 range, well, top 16 range at least. So hopefully we can start seeing it push into top 8 range very shortly, which we do in, I think, at least one of the tournaments coming up. There is one Rapid Strike list that makes it into... Sorry, I'm trying to work out when to put my drink. There is at least one Rapid Strike list that makes it into top 8. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Chill was the next tournament with nearly 400 players, which was crazy. And it was a Desi Eternatus final, which I think not many people would have predicted. A Desi Eternatus final is very, very interesting in terms of sort of old archetypes coming back. And as you can see, this Desi list has absolutely no answers. So this is just a matchup roulette Desi. Kind of hope that your opponent doesn't have answers, and because you're not playing the answers to the answers. And yeah, that's a very bold strategy, I think, especially with the amount of different answers people have started to try out. Things, you know, people have started to add in answers for Volcanion in Desi, so completely cutting the answers for Volcanion is kind of scary. They do play 2 Weak Guard, interestingly. But yeah, that's kind of their only insurance against things like Volk. There's a couple of other answers out there. Things like Dragapult is a bit scary for the deck, just because naturally being able to spread counters onto the bench as well as have a shred attack is kind of scary, but you do have Big Charms to kind of supplement that a little bit. Playing a Tackle engine is pretty interesting. Guzhala's searching out the energy. Malolana to try and heal off some of this like the damage. So I guess I guess the intention was more to outlive the opponent than necessarily try and deal with their answers. But yeah, and we see a couple more of these styles of lists coming up, which is really interesting. Like I say, I'm not the biggest fan of cutting answers from a deck where you want to be walling. It feels like if your main strategy is trying to wall, trying to force your opponent to have answers, cutting the answers for their answers, it feels to me very scary, just because you want to be able to deal with them, deal with whatever the answers they have, because that's leaning into your win con. But yeah, obviously it did really well. Next up we have another Eternatus list. I realise I haven't really been image generating any of these. This was one of the first Eternatus lists that we saw playing Weak Guard Energy, along with the Hammers. Very interesting. The Weak Guard Energy has started to pick up in favour, but I think the meta is already beginning to adapt to it, which is interesting. Obviously, Weak Guards helping against the Urshifus of the world, but with some techs here and there, things like Fan of Wave and Giratina. I don't know how long this will last. It feels like it was a very flash in the pan type thing, and it may not last, but we'll have to wait and see. Playing the Crushings, of course, somehow. Deck's still finding space for Crushings, but Crushings can win you games, so makes sense. 6 and 1 spinner, or 9 and 1 spinner, is kind of scary, I must admit, but I guess because this is colourless cost, it kind of doesn't matter what energy you attach to a turn 1 if you're power accelerating, but you still do need to find the darks, so it can be a little bit scary still. But I guess you have a little bit of insurance if you have the Weak Guard against at least the Urshifu matchups. And then finally the Phoebe is the only other point of note, not really helping against too much in general, because you can't recycle it very well, but you can at least like go through one Zamazenta in some of the like Corviknight. Obviously it gets through Decidueyes, gets through Zamazentas, gets through Altarias, but typically Desis and Altarias, they're going to be multiple, so you're going to have to deal with multiple of them. You do have some answers, but obviously these aren't the greatest of answers. But this Phoebe helps you at least deal with one Zamazenta, again in things like Luke Metal, and even if Bronzong is playing it, something like that. You can then try and find your prizes elsewhere. So I don't particularly like the Phoebe because it's not it's not hugely recyclable. You can't use it too often, but in those niche situations where there was a time this week where we saw even things like Pikarom playing one Zamazenta just to try and stall stuff out. So yeah, it helps in those niche scenarios for sure. Another Inteleon, again, very, very similar list, making top 4, I think it was. This one a little bit more sort of in the vein of 4 Quick Ball, though this is still a very, very low energy, low ball search count. But yeah, we've seen this list do well this week. If you want a bit more in depth on Inteleon as an archetype in general, make sure you head over to Joe's video. Another Decidueye, obviously no answers and this sort of tag call build. I don't know whether the lists are identical. I don't think they are, but I could be wrong. But I don't think they were completely identical. But yeah. Oh, I've just realised I've been looking at the tournament after that. Ignore me. Sorry, we have two ADPs in top 4. So yeah, sorry, I was looking at Hegster. That's spoilers for Hegster coming up in a second. This is kind of so this was the highest placing ADP. This is kind of the I think more where we're going with this. So it looks like this list was actually playing no switch, just all in on escape ropes, which I think is also pretty wild. I think high switch, high escape rope count is very important in the deck. Again, just to be able to cycle your Zacian. But I do really like ropes in the deck, to be honest. And I think rope will probably become pretty much a mainstay card in general. We had another couple of ADPs and another World of Mewtwo. Again, there was nothing too relevant about those or too special about those lists. There was another Dragapult list, another straight Dragapult list though, making top 8. This was more of a ability-based list though, so no Greens engine, no, Omastar, none of that stuff. Instead, running the Jirachi package with Scoop Up Nets and then some Crushing Hammers and that kind of thing to try and slow the opponent down. Nothing major. Power Plants is one of the biggest things to note, simply because, it's good to note that Power Plant is a thing because we're starting to see a couple of decks move towards this Power Plant and double Crobat engine. It's actually only playing one Crobat in this instance, but there's been a couple of successful lists recently playing sort of 2 or 3 Power Plant and then 2 or 3 Crobat and just dropping the Dedenne completely. So yeah, that's pretty interesting to see. I think it won't be a trend that sticks around for too long because Dedenne is too strong of a card. It's probably going to be one of those things where it sort of ebbs and flows. The more Power Plant there is, the less steady there is, and then when everyone realizes everyone's moving to Power Plant Crobat lists, they'll start dropping them, and then Dedenne will come back. I don't think it's gone, I don't think that is going to be a massive change though. I think Dedenne is still going to be in everyone's, or the majority of decks. It's just lists like these where this list can go sort of Power Plant Crobat focused, or swap out the Power Plants and find space for a couple of Dedennes. It's just going to be these kinds of lists that I think may ebb and flow between playing the Power Plants and not. So yeah, and then finally a Lapras did pretty well, making top 8. This was another kind of big hype deck from the stream, or hype deck from the tournament, I remember. Obviously, Lapras kind of was capitalizing on Picarom's quote-unquote decline. Level Ball helping you search out the Frostmoths and stuff is pretty good. Good thing to note is that even if you go second, with Lapras, you don't need Snom because Lapras's first attack lets you attach some energy, so you actually don't need Snom if you're going second, as long as your Lapras is fairly safe. And against a few decks, your Lapras probably will be safe. There's a couple of decks where it won't be. Things like Victini and stuff. Ironically, the Fire deck is actually one of the matchups you're most scared of if you're going second and you don't find a Snom. But if you do find a Snom, at that point you're able to coast pretty well because you can just power through them super easy. But yeah, like I say, in general, Frostmoth decks have just started to come back typically because of the Level Ball reintroduction to the format. But yeah, this kind of evolved, as you can see here, into an Inteleon deck. Obviously, they're fairly different. The Inteleon deck that I mentioned, or that I showed, ran the single prize Inteleon line as well, which the Lapras deck didn't. But yeah, this I feel is kind of taken the mantle of the water deck in the format right now. But yeah, this is Hexa Season 3. We've obviously talked about a couple of these lists already, accidentally. First things first, though, we did see a Mad Party take down the tournament. Again, kind of nothing special to say here other than we knew Mad Party was going to be getting stronger because it got Level Ball. Its typing is great. Its aggression is fine. It's scared of things like Dragapult, of course. A Rise in Dragapult is obviously terrible for it because Dragapult is just a horrendous matchup. They're able to deal with the Poltergeists and the Sinistes very easily, as well as you having to two-shot through them whilst they're almost certainly taking 2 prizes a turn. So yeah, Dragapult is a very scary matchup. But other than that, I think the deck can hold its own. It's still a little bit clunky, and it doesn't like the fact that Dedennes are even more of a high priority target right now. Puts a lot more pressure on things like Giovanni's Exile. But yeah, I think it can hold its own. But I think it will. I think Dragapult is here to stay, to be honest. And I think the more Dragapult climbs in play, the less we will see from Mad Party. So yeah, that was up against a Decidueye in top 8 again, or in the final. Again, just a super no answers, just 4-2-4 Decidueye. I have an ability, deal with me kind of list. And again, similarly, this list was also the same. So yeah, we've looked at the Inteleon list. A surprise Picarom in top 8 from the classic player Bendover. I had to laugh when we saw that name, I must admit. Pikarom, I think people never really write Pikarom off, and I think that's for fair reason at this point. Pikarom has been through the wars and emerged victorious in formats over and over again. There hasn't really been a format where it's been completely dead, and even now, it turns out we're not in one. Got the Mewtwo's for the psychic stuff, or for the fighting stuff, I should say. Basically, there's nothing new about this list. It's just saying Pikarom was still good. Pikarom is one of the best decks in the format pre-rotation. Everyone's moved away from Temposation playing Swords, which was a very, very intimidating matchup for Pikarom. So now that the format has slowed down a bit again, because you don't have Zacians one-shotting you every turn, at least from turn 2, you can get value from Pikaroms again. And yeah, obviously that the list did very, very well. You'll see Pikarom re-emerge in 9th place there, and also a little bit later on as well. Excuse me. Another couple of sort of standard lists. We've got an ADP and an Eternatus in top 8. This is the first Rapid Strike. I believe this is the first Rapid Strike top 8 in general. I could be wrong. Maybe there was a couple in the first weekend of tournaments. I don't think there was though. So this might be the first Rapid Strike top 8. As you can see, it's a dojo build, which is interesting. Basic fightings and dojos. Essentially no other attackers, just pure Rapid Strike, which I think is falling out of favour, personally, for me. I think Rapid Strike is best with a partner. There's a variety of different partners you can play, but regardless, this list seemed to do pretty well. Again, leaning into the Crobats rather than the Denes, interestingly. Got the Jirachi. Other than that, kind of the only huge point of note is the double martial arts dojo, as well as the one Evo Incense, considering there's only 3 targets for it. Quite interesting. But yeah, very interesting stuff. First, well, the breakout success for Rapid Strike. Pretty interesting to see. There was another one make top 16, along with 3 Victinis. No Victinis in top 8 of this tournament, but 3 made it to top 16, so still not a terrible deck to get you into, you know, the deeper parts of the tournament. But I don't think we've had a Victini making it into the finals as of yet this week, in this week's data. It could be wrong. I could have forgotten about one, but maybe the first. No. We have. I don't think we've had a Victini yet. At least in the finals, I should say. So yeah, the Limitless Weekly was the next tournament with, I think there was around 367 players. So these tournaments have pretty big numbers behind them, which is interesting. Good to see as well. And it was actually Spiritomb that took the tournament down. Again, another deck that kind of is surprising to see. Kind of came out of nowhere. Basically, you know, this we knew the whole Switch and Birdkeeper and Spikemuth combo was a thing, but with the addition of Escape Rope, it means you can actually rack up your damage counters very, very quickly, and you can be hitting, you know, 6-7 damage counters on your Spiritombs in one turn, pushing you up to like 220 damage, that kind of thing. And that's obviously very scary, especially when you're combining the effect of Rope bringing something up as well. That's obviously huge, because it means you're probably taking 2 prizes every turn. I think typically, obviously they still play the 3 bosses orders, but typically, from what I haven't tested the deck myself, but from what I've seen and heard from other people that have tested the deck, you're taking 2 prizes every turn. You're pretty much gusting stuff every turn because you have 4 Rope and 3 boss, and basically all of your Spiritombs are just threats always. The addition of Cape plus Spikemuth pushes them into such huge damage range. You can get into very, very scary numbers very quickly. There's loads of switching options. Even Scoop Up Nets kind of count. So you've got, you know, 12, 15 switching options in the deck. And basically every one of those is plus 60 damage to some extent. So yeah, very, very interesting. And great to see Spiritomb kind of come out of nowhere and come in swinging and do really, really well. It was against a, yeah, I was just going to say, it's nice to see this archetype kind of do well out of nowhere, because I feel like no one has spoken about Spiritomb as well. Very, very cool. It was against an Eternatus list, playing sort of heavy Yveltal and again the weak guards. Power plants are becoming, well, have always kind of ebbed and flowed in Eternatus anyway, but We're seeing a little bit more of them recently. We feel like I feel like this is. I'm moving away from the idea that this is one of the best ways to play it though, simply because Ziggy Net feels like it's very, very good right now for dealing with a lot of these one prize basics. So heavy Zigzagoons, heavy nets, to try and take advantage of a lot of these basic Pokemon being played. Things like Spiritooms, Mad Parties, Jirachis, Mews, all of that kind of stuff. You can really capitalize on a lot of those Pokemon with a heavy Ziggy, heavy net build. So I think I'm going to try that at some point this week. I'm obviously still a little bit scared about fighting stuff, but yeah, Weak Guard kind of helps against that, but I think the fighting lists are already adapting to that. Another standout deck was this green Mewtwo deck. Sort of Mewtwo Rillaboom is an archetype that's relatively undiscovered, and I'm not even convinced that it's anything new out of this set that made this deck good. I just think maybe people hadn't tried it enough, because nothing on this list screams to me this is good now because of battle styles. You know, there's one new card, it's an escape rope. Other than that, you know, we could have played this deck a long, long time ago. So I'm super curious to see whether this translates into further results. You'll see this list crop up again momentarily, but just loads of different answers. Incineroar, Dragonite, the Buzzmosa, and the Vileplume, all very, very efficient attackers, as well as sort of Rowig in general, just being able to set up your Rillabooms. You have the Mewtwo's for the fire matchups, you have the Rowigs for the psychic matchups. And from there, basically just saying, well, Rillaboom can hopefully provide energy acceleration on a par with something like a Welder Mewtwo list. But instead, I get to Marnie, I get to Boss, I get to use these other supporters rather than having to Welder every turn. And use some of these cool attacks. So yeah, very interesting. I'm going to be excited to see where this goes. This has only had a couple of placements, but the couple of placements that it's had have been incredibly impressive. So yeah, looking forward to seeing how this deck evolves in the meta. So yeah, I think the only other list that was of major note here was the Rapid Strike Urshi list. This was a lightning-based list with Tapu Koko. This is one of the earliest lists that we profiled for Battle Styles on the channel, so it's really cool to see someone trying out the lightning variant. This is actually a viewer of the channel who was kind of playing along with me when I was playing in the tournament, so it's cool to see a viewer doing well. And it was cool to see them using this Tapu Koko engine, which I still think is a very, very underrated engine. Being able to just power up the Rapid Strike in one turn is insanely strong, I think. Interestingly, double Escape Rope, double Scoop Up Net. Again, I would like to see maybe a little bit more switching options, but there are enough there. The one Fan of Waves and the one Great Catcher, as well as the two telescopic sights. I'm still playing sights in this list. I think Joe has cut his for more consistency. So interesting to see people still trying out the sights, maybe at the sort of detriment of a little bit of consistency. But there is, a Kricketune and the Jirachi package in here as well. So kind of makes up for the slight lack of, or the more aggressive list from the sites. You also have the backup draw options, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, other than that, I don't think there's really too much else to say about any of these lists. Tag switch in a Pikarom was one of the only other things I have written down here as something worth noting, but you will see momentarily Pikarom. We'll be taking a look at Pikarom again in a sec. A couple of other interesting lists. The only other one was a Psychic Mewtwo. We haven't really seen Psychic Mewtwo do well in a while. This list is very interesting to me just because the energy acceleration looks to be purely Star Search, which is very scary. Because if you're... I guess the plan is go for like a Horror House into a Night Watch. But if your Horror House or your Night Watch is prized, it feels like you could be in Spot of Bother in certain situations, which is a little bit scary to me, I must admit. So yeah, obviously this list was very, very good when we had Malamar in format. But with the lack of energy acceleration, only having Star Surge, I'm not overly convinced that this will be as consistent as some of the other sort of Mewtwo builds and the acceleration that they have. This definitely has the least amount of acceleration, so yeah, very interesting to see. Cool to see this do really, really well though. And Solgaleo Lunala is a card that I haven't seen in what feels like forever, so cool to see that do well as well. And then finally we have the Sunday Open, and this was a very, very interesting event because as you see right here, in first place, our mate Gustavo Fring with Pikarom winning the event. Pikarom, again, like I said, the deck that some people deemed to be dead, taking down yet another tournament in format that is once again arguably terrible for it. Doing really, really well though. Playing the Vikavolt for some of the smaller sort of basic matchups, things like Spiritomb and Mad Party. I have seen the player discuss this list on Twitter ever since, and they said they didn't feel Vikavolt was overly important. They just wanted to have it in due to an expected influx of Spiritomb players just because Spiritomb won the night before. So that makes sense. They also said Swell is irrelevant because it doesn't help you win the fire matchups, which is very interesting. I think Swell is one of the best cards in the deck personally because being able to stamp Swell people is very strong, I think. But obviously this list didn't need Swell to do well, so that's fair enough. Tag Switch, again, is the other big card. It's interesting to see Tag Switch back in the format. I think it's a pretty cool card, to be honest. It lets you power up one of these tag teams in one turn, which is very important, especially when we're seeing decks that have answers to Pikachu, to Pikarom and Mewtwo. You need to be able to power each of these up very quickly in order to kind of adapt to whatever your opponent's doing, because they could have answers for either of these on a whim, basically. So yeah, very, very cool to see. Pikarom still not dead. We had a couple of Victinis in top 4. This is actually like a two phase tournament. So all of these players made it like phase 2, but this was just the top 4. This Victini is pretty much sort of all in on just going for Victini. There's no well, there are a couple of extra attackers, but it feels like this is, you know, compared to the list we saw earlier on, this is a boss turn 2 kind of Victini list. No Stamps is interesting. I've heard a lot of good things about Stamp in the list. Obviously, Stamp is inherently not a consistency card, so I can see why you maybe would be drawn away from playing it. But yeah, Stamps, I've heard very, very good things about Stamps in the list, so it would be interesting to hear, well, kind of understand why they weren't necessary. I want to try a Stampless list when I get my hands on some Victinis. But yeah, there's also no real Urshifu answers other than going first and trying to boss them turn 2. There's no, you know, sort of way of being able to deal with the fact that they can just snipe you, well, not whenever they want, but they can snipe you. You know, if they're playing an Empoleon, you're going to have a pretty bad time as well. Well, not a bad time. You're going to have a worse time than usual because you've got the Jirachi package, plus also Empoleon is just a really, really efficient attacker against you. So there's no major Urshifu answers. I don't think the deck needs them, per se. But no Mew is interesting, nonetheless. And yeah, I think the only other list I have written down here that was super interesting was the Eternatus list that made top 4. Obviously, again, pretty standard, but the one interesting thing to look at here is sort of the Power Plant plus Dangerous Drill combo. Kind of one-locking in your Power Plant in terms of being able to get rid of Swells, but also Drill is a super live card right now. It hits a load of different tools, it hits a load of different special energy, hits some pretty cool stadiums as well. Things like Tower of Waters and stuff, even if you're unable to find your plants. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Not the highest Pokemon count for Drill, excuse me, which is a bit scary. But other than that, pretty standard list. No weak guards as well, just sticking to the basics. So yeah, very, very interesting stuff. We see a couple of other lists here and there. We've got a single strike. There's been no single strike lists to look at though this week, interestingly. So single strike did well in the first weekend, but didn't do great in the second weekend. And I think that is somewhat typical of the deck success, but we'll have to see how that goes. The final 2 things I want to look at is, first off, the breakdown of the top 16 placements. This is taking into account all of the tournaments over 100 players so far. So this is also taking into account the week 1 results. No, it's not. Sorry, this is only taking into the week 2, taking into account the week 2 results. Let me quickly change that because we want to kind of get a bit of a better idea in general of what's doing, or what's continuing to do well. Let me zoom back in on the top 10 as well. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think that's 10, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Sweet. So we've got, so this is the total top 16s of each archetype. I appreciate it's a little bit hard to see the names of the archetypes, so let me zoom in a touch. Zacian ADP at the top with 15 top 16 so far. Victini coming up second. You can also kind of see the deck's win rate as well, which is interesting. So yeah, Victini coming in second, Weldon Mewtwo third, Pikarom actually the 4th most successful top 16 deck right now. Very interesting. Senti and Urshifu in that same bracket as Pikarom, then Eternatus and Decidueye, and finally Mad Party and Dragapult. So yeah, that's the sort of breakdown of the top 16 placements, and this is a bit more of a matchup guide in terms of kind of matchup analysis and where things are at. This is basically looking at the majority of the most successful decks, though I am going to quickly add in Weldon Mewtwo and Pikarom and take out Single Strike and Blounds. And then we're looking at kind of the most successful, or the most played decks, or some of the most played decks, I should say. So yeah, you kind of start to get a bit more of a picture. Obviously, last week's picture there was a few more blanks here and there in terms of what was doing well and how many matchups we'd had. Now we have 6 tournaments. We can start to see a bit more of a trend as to some matchups, and yeah, pretty interesting to go over. I'm not going to sort of bore you with all of this. You can read the numbers. You can kind of understand what they're all about. There's obvious kind of things here, you know, Eternatus having a great Dragapult, Mad Party having a terrible Dragapult, that kind of thing. Some of the interesting ones to look at, I think Pikarom is an interesting one to look at. There's only 3 matchups right now that are negative for it. That's Eternatus, Mad Party, and Rapid Strike. Eternatus has always kind of been bad. Mad Party has never been the greatest, but never been, like, absolutely terrible, but it's never been the greatest. And Rapid Strike being far closer than people perhaps initially expected is interesting. Similarly, we can see Rapid Strike is really starting to push up some of its win rates. There's still a few sub 50%. ADPization is still sub 50% with a very, very high sample size, so that's starting to look like a slightly favored Zacian matchup. Weldon Mewtwo, obviously a pretty terrible matchup. Victini, slightly under 50%, as well as Dragapult, obviously. And finally, the Victini matchup spread, again, is pretty impressive in all honesty. Obviously, Senti, Dragapult, and Eternatus, all V-based decks, all great matchups against those. Pikarom, pretty terrible because it's not a V-based deck, similarly with Weldon Mewtwo. So both those matchups are pretty bad, kind of exactly what we expected. The V Pokemon, the Victini likes to Gust Up and KO, does really well against those. Otherwise, it doesn't do well against. It typically doesn't do well against some of these tag team decks. So yeah, very, very interesting stuff. Feel free to give this a bit of a pause if you want to look into the results a little bit more, or obviously head over to dinodata.app and check out the results for yourself. I really highly recommend this website. We rave about it so much on the channel, but it's honestly really, really good for looking at matchups and analysis and that kind of thing. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed taking a look, a bit of a deeper dive into this week's tournaments. It was a little bit longer than I expected, nearly 40 minutes I guess, but a lot of great results to look at here. 5 very, very big tournaments with nearly all of them had over 200 players. So very, very important data and great to look at. Very relevant as well. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I've been Jack from Omnipoke, and I look forward to seeing you guys in another video soon. Cheers, everyone.